his plan. With a clear understanding of the enemy order of battle, capabilities, recent activities, and relative combat power, the leader begins to visualize how the enemy may array and fight his forces. Begin with what you understand to be your enemy opponent's purpose and task. Next, determine what you believe the enemy's decisive point is. A decisive point is a geographic place, specific key event, critical factor, or function that, when acted upon, allows a leader to gain a marked advantage over an adversary in achieving mission success. In plain terms, it's the moment where the battle tips in the favor of oneself. Determine the enemy's form of maneuver or defensive technique. The tactics of offensive and defensive operations are not covered in this video series. That is an entirely different skill set. Instead, this video series goes over the steps of applying TLPs and not tactics. Then, determine the doctrinal requirements to achieve the enemy's offensive or defensive concept, and determine what the decisive, shaping, and sustaining operational purposes are for this tactical concept. Next, decide the tasks necessary for the decisive, shaping, and sustaining operations to achieve their purposes. Note that the decisive, shaping, and sustaining operations are defined later in this video, as well as main and supporting efforts. Once you've generated a broad idea for options on how the enemy will fight, the next step is to array forces. Reference the tasks you anticipate the enemy will attempt to accomplish and determine how much combat power is needed to accomplish each task. Identify where on the battlefield the enemy's forward edge of battle area is, or his line of departure will be. When arraying enemy forces, a red checkbook method is helpful. A checkbook is a menu of all assets, both personnel and key equipment, the enemy has available. Assume that the leader takes inventory of these items 2 levels below the echelon he leads. For example, an enemy platoon leader would array subordinate elements and key weapon systems at the team and crew level, 2 levels below the leadership of him. Think of them like chess pieces to array on the battlefield. When arraying forces, determine what the enemy needs to achieve his decisive point first, and array the forces to achieve that. With the remainder forces, determine how to support the elements achieving the decisive point. Finally, determine what remaining elements can provide sustaining support. Next, it is time to develop a concept of the operation. Again, this video series does not address tactics. It focuses on the steps of the TLPs. However, in developing a concept of the operation, a leader assesses the best techniques to fight and achieve the commander's intent. It's necessary to understand if the tactical plan will unfold in a simultaneous or sequential way. Control measures are critical for all leaders to properly manage the execution and flow of battle. Once you determine how many assets to apply to the decisive, shaping, and sustaining operations, use any remaining forces to strengthen reserve elements or intelligence surveillance efforts. The next step is to assign responsibilities. Determine how the enemy leader will put each of his subordinate leaders in charge of the arrayed forces. Now create a course of action statement and sketch. The statement was broadly created during the generate option step, and the sketch was visualized during the development of the concept step. A proper course of action statement has the following attributes. These clearly describe the enemy's concept for his operation. Review the components of a proper COA statement here. Here is an example of a course of action sketch. This would be overlaid onto a map to create the enemy SITTEMP. In this SITTEMP, you can see the arrangement of enemy forces and key equipment, with proper tasks and purposes for the enemy leader's subordinate elements. This video series does not cover how to identify the military symbols used in the example, but it does provide a concept of which types of information an enemy SITTEMP contains. Here are some expected items to include into an enemy SITTEMP. Next, the leader determines what his enemy's information requirements will be. Both elements of the commander's critical information requirements, or CCIR, which are composed of priority intelligence requirements, or called PIR, and friendly forces intelligence requirements, or FFIR. Additionally, essential elements of friendly information, or abbreviated EEFI. Following this analysis, the leader has all the information to brief his subordinates on the enemy's most likely course of action and the enemy's most dangerous course of action. The most dangerous course of action refers to what you assess the enemy could do, in that it is the worst case scenario for friendly forces' own course of action to deal with. Next is for the leader to assess friendly forces available to himself. The blue checkbook method is the same as what the leader did during the analysis of the enemy forces. The leader determines the composition, disposition, and strength of his own assets assigned under him. and creates a visual list to identify all elements and key pieces of equipment 2 levels below him. This will help him in his own course of action development. Assessing time is critical to tactical leaders. There are many timeline benchmarks a leader must take into account for operations. Leaders determine the critical times necessary to achieve a mission success. When determining time requirements, leaders should conduct backwards planning, starting from mission completion and assessing the time requirement for each prior step, backwards to the time he issues his operation order. The golden rule is to ensure that all the time a leader has to plan, he provides 1/3 for himself and 2/3 to his subordinates to do their own planning. This is known as the 1/3, 2/3 rule. There are 4 primary timelines all leaders need to take into account when planning combat operations. These are described by the mnemonic HOPE: hire, operational, planning, and enemy. All 4 of these efforts have their own timeline that a leader needs to be aware of and integrate their planning and execution efforts with. Here is an example of a tool leaders can use to visually represent all the activities across time with the HOPE efforts, and it includes weather and light data or information collection times. In this example, H hour refers to hit hour as determined by hire, and everything minus H is before the pre-coordinated time for hit hour, and everything plus H is after hit hour. The final step in mission analysis is to determine any civil considerations. Civil considerations uses the mnemonic A-scope to determine areas, structures, capabilities, organizations, people, and events. Areas describes localities and aspects of the terrain that are not normally military significant. Structures determine how the locations, functions, and capabilities can support the operation. Capabilities are assets that either save, sustain, or enhance life. Organizations are non-military groups or institutions in the area of operation. People refer to non-military personnel possibly encountered by military forces. And events are activities that significantly affect organizations, people, and military operations. Leaders at all levels must assess the possible impact of civil considerations on their operations. Politics, boundaries, media, and the welfare of people have a heavy impact on tactical operations. Now that the leader has analyzed the mission by the variables of METTC, he needs to assess risk. Risk assessment is identification and assessment of hazards, allowing a leader to implement controls to mitigate the hazards. There are 2 types of risk: tactical and accidental. Tactical risk has 2 forms: enemy action and lost opportunity. Leaders balance the amount of tactical risk they are willing to take for an operation, and mindfully choose how they will mitigate that risk. Additionally, leaders develop control measures to minimize possible accidental risk. Armed with a deeper understanding of his mission, the terrain, time constraints, his troops and equipment available, operational risks, civilians in the area of operation, and the likely enemy course of action, the leader is prepared to build his own tactical plan and achieve his assigned mission. Identifying a tentative decisive point and verifying it during course of action development is the most important aspect of TLPs. As discussed in enemy analysis, the decisive point is where the battle tips in the favor of one side. Leaders identify where and when the unit will accomplish its purpose, and that is the decisive point. Then leaders develop an entire course of action around that moment in battle. Course of action development, or COA-DEV, is the process leaders use to determine how the mission will be accomplished. COA-DEV identifies how the leader will generate overwhelming combat power on the enemy at the decisive point. In planning, leaders begin at the decisive point and work backwards to the start of the mission. Good courses of action are flexible to adjust to unforeseen events and allow subordinates to use initiative. All courses of action must be suitable, feasible, acceptable, distinguishable, and complete to be considered a tenable plan of action. Again, the leader uses AGADAPT to develop his course of action, just like he did to determine the enemy course of action. Analyze relative combat power in 4 key ways. Identify enemy weakness to exploit, identify friendly strengths to exploit on the enemy weakness, identify enemy strengths to mitigate, identify friendly weakness to protect. This may help to clarify the tentative decisive point. Determine the required force ratio for attack or defense, and evaluate strengths and weaknesses compared between enemy and friendly by warfighting function. Similar to enemy analysis, a matrix technique is common. Again, here is a matrix technique with warfighting functions on the left and enemy, friendly, deductions, and tactics, techniques, and procedures, or TTPs, across the top. When used, a leader can identify enemy strengths and weaknesses by warfighting function, and see what friendly strengths and weaknesses counter or mitigate the enemy and determine the best TTPs to apply. Once the leader analyzes the relative combat power, next is to generate options. Most missions and tasks can be accomplished in more than one way. Options should defeat all the enemy courses of action identified during mission analysis. In developing options, leaders consider TTPs from doctrine, historical examples, and/or the commander's guidance. Identify task and purpose for your mission, and first task your decisive operation to achieve the decisive point. Further expand on options by brainstorming. In this step, leaders visualize a variety of ways to tactically complete the mission. With the unit's purpose in mind, the decisive point, and the tactical task required of the unit, select the form of maneuver or defensive technique. Then determine the decisive operation and needed shaping or sustaining operations, followed by the task each subordinate element must conduct. This video series does not discuss specific offense or defensive tactics, and only focuses on the steps of the TLPs. The decisive operation refers to one specific subordinate element which directly accomplishes the mission and intent. It is the focal point. Shaping operations refer to any number of subordinate elements that establish conditions for the decisive operation to achieve the decisive point. And sustaining operations are any number of subordinate elements that enable both decisive and shaping operations to achieve their tasks by focusing internally on friendly forces. Operations are typically phased. Although the decisive operation is the prominent subordinate unit for the overall mission and is tasked to achieve the decisive point, at different phases of the operation, other subordinate elements may be more critical at that point in time. For this, leaders identify which element is the main and supporting efforts by phase or subphase. The main effort is the subordinate element that is most critical in a given point in time across the whole operation. Main efforts often shift as units move through phases and subphases of the operation. Similarly, supporting efforts are units that focus on enabling the main effort at different points in time. The decisive operation is not always the main effort. Tactical mission tasks are specific activities a unit or subordinate unit must perform during operations. There are mutually understood definitions and are expressed as either actions by a friendly force or effects on an enemy force. Army doctrine has many tactical tasks already well defined and used in combat operations. However, leaders can add to this list if needed, so long as subordinates clearly understand what the task means. Here are some doctrinal tasks by friendly or on the enemy. These doctrinal tasks are elements of operations and subordinate tasks. And here are doctrinal shaping operations and tasks. Following these steps, the leader now has a clear purpose, task, decisive point, form of maneuver, task organization, and the tasks and purposes for the decisive operation, shaping operation, and any sustaining operation. With this, the leader begins a more detailed brainstorming on how to achieve the mission. After brainstorming and selecting the best scheme of maneuver, the leader then arrays his forces. First, determine the required combat power against the enemy for each task. Then, identify your forward edge of battle area, or FIBA, or your line of departure, or LD. That's your start point. Array your forces starting at the decisive point and then working backwards in time to determine how best to position your subordinate elements. The blue checkbook method is useful as a visual inventory of all the assets a leader has to their disposal. Leaders plan 2 levels down. That is to say, a platoon leader does not just plan on how to employ his immediately subordinate squads. He goes down 1 level further to the fire team and crew serve weapons level, then arrays assets at that level in his planning. Later, he will assign subordinate leaders to manage those assets during operations. Reference doctrine, history, TTPs, and your commander's guidance to determine the appropriate task organization to conduct specific tactical tasks. Different tactical tasks may have different task organizations to best achieve that tactical task. With a selected task organization, the leader reviews all the assets available 2 levels down. The blue checkbook technique, seen here, is an example of a selected form of maneuver against a template enemy position, with available assets to array on the right-hand side. The leader can then arrange the assets to achieve his decisive point. Next is to develop the concept of the operation, once the forces have been arrayed at the decisive point. The concept of the operation describes how the arrayed forces will accomplish the mission and describes all key activities. For example, movement, breaching operations, actions on the objective, consolidation and reorganization, actions in the engagement area, and counterattacks. It should describe if actions happen sequential or simultaneous, to time the actions of your subordinate elements. It is very important to develop proper control measures for managing movement of subordinate elements in space and time, as well as control of direct fire and indirect fires. The concept of the operation should discuss any indirect fire requirements and timing, other support and sustainment efforts, and mindfully use any remaining assets available for needs such as reserves, information collection, or further weighing the decisive operation. With this, an initial concept sketch can be developed. Next is to assign responsibilities to the identified task organization. Assign subordinate leaders to manage the decisive, shaping, and sustaining operations. Proper span of control is between 2 and 5 subordinate elements to any leader. Attempt to leverage existing unit integrity when possible. Make command and control as simple as possible and consider any special leadership assignments during the overall operation. Finally, prepare a course of action statement and sketch to fully articulate the well-analyzed and developed plan. Here is an example of the elements in a well-structured course of action statement. The purpose of the operation, what's decisive to the operation and why, the tactical risk and mitigation measures, the form of maneuver, the tasks and purpose for the decisive, shaping, and sustaining operations, reserve planning priorities, purpose of applicable warfighting functions, and end state as it relates to friendly, enemy, terrain, and civilians if necessary. Here's an example of a proper course of action statement. Pause the video and read if you like. Next is the course of action sketch. Carry over what was drafted when developing the concept, then assign the tasks and purposes for each subordinate element. The sketch can be a map overlay or a freehand drawn picture. Here is an example of a concept sketch. Pause the video and review if you like. If time permits, develop multiple different courses of action and use wargaming techniques to compare and find a superior plan. The process of wargaming helps to test or improve even a single course of action. Wargaming builds out the concepts and develops a more thorough plan. It helps a leader think through actions, reactions, and counter-reactions between him and the enemy, of which he may not have thought about during Agadab. A mindful leader devotes a great amount of time in properly wargaming a concept of the operation to find flaws and mitigate those flaws in planning. Gaining and maintaining the initiative is critical in battle. When you have the initiative, your opponent is reacting to you and is less on balance. Look for ways to gain the initiative through wargaming. Wargaming allows combat leaders to synchronize warfighting functions during the operation. It fleshes out requirements for specific time-based actions across the battle space and necessary triggers to initiate actions. Leaders identify possible branch plans to allow more flexibility in their concept. Identifying all control measures required to control his forces and lethal effects. Synchronizes all subordinates and coordination instructions for the operation. Identifies any information requirements that need to be answered to better modify the plan. Provides assessments on possible on-order or be prepared to missions, and projects additional combat service support requirements. There are 3 wargaming techniques: belt, avenue in depth, and box method. This video series does not detail how to go about a proper wargaming session. It provides reference that wargaming is part of planning and has these advantages and components to them. During wargaming, sketch notes are tools that help identify action, reaction, and counterreaction between enemy and friendly, and are generally recorded by phase or subphase and viewed from the lens of the warfighting functions. This method allows leaders to think through each critical step and determine how to react or modify the plan to mitigate issues. It can also illuminate possible decision points during the operation, where the leader must choose an action based on battle space conditions or interactions with the enemy. Decision points generally drive the need to answer information requirements. Additional control measures may be identified in this process to better control subordinate elements or lethal effects. If the leader has enough time to develop more than one course of action and wargame each of them separately, it is useful to compare them against each other in course of action analysis. Typically, there is weighted criteria to evaluate each course of action, and the leader reviews which scores the best. At the TOP process, leaders use course of action analysis to identify which course of action has the highest chance of success, minimize risk, and has most flexibility. Finally, the leader selects the best course of action, or blends multiple courses of action into a hybrid course of action. He is now prepared to issue the final planning guidance, with the complete plan in hand. He then updates his subordinates on any new information he's learned to better prepare them before receiving the order. The fourth step of the troop leading procedure process is initiate movement. Initiate movement happens throughout the TLP process whenever the leader requires. For example, giving instructions to reconnaissance assets, guides, courting parties, or moving to the staging area. The fifth step in the troop leading procedure process is conduct reconnaissance. Conduct reconnaissance also happens throughout the TLP process. Reconnaissance can be conducted in many forms. Optimally, the leader visually observes the area of operation and objectives. But at a minimum, a detailed map reconnaissance with imagery and intelligence products can be used. Leaders can send recon assets to confirm or deny assumptions and see information gaps from planning. The leader is now ready for the sixth step in the troop leading procedure process, which is complete the plan. The leader incorporates the results of mission analysis and course of action development with any reconnaissance information to complete their plan and prepare the issue for order. The leader develops the written order, overlays, indirect fire list, and visual aids for briefing. At this stage, the leader makes final coordination with higher and adjacent elements. Reference to earlier in this video about the 5-paragraph op order structure. The leader inputs all information from his higher order, his own mission analysis, and course of action development into the written order of his own. He includes any graphics or other documents as annexes to his order. Control measures are critical during combat operations. One tool that leaders may choose to use is a synchronization matrix. Here is an example of one such tool. There are many versions across units. Detailed and accurate operational graphics are critical for mission execution. Subordinate leaders should have a copy of the operational graphics to fully understand how the battle space is divided up and named, and the movements and tactical tasks for units in the operation. Operational graphics should provide a very clear visual representation of the operation and who is doing what, where. When placed on a map overlay, operational graphics are referred to as operational overlays and are used to control the movement of forces during operations. Operations graphics along with the synchronization matrix will constitute the scheme of maneuver portion of the operations order brief and should contain at a minimum the following: all higher level graphics, axes of advance, routes, directions of attack to and from the attack position to the assault position, all phase lines and checkpoints, probable line of deployment, assault positions, directions of attack for subordinate elements, support by fire positions, tentative breach sites and objectives, directions of attack for subordinate elements to support by fire positions, tentative breach sites, all support by fire and attack by fire positions, all objectives and sub-objectives, unit icons, task and purpose for the decisive, shaping, and sustaining operations, reconnaissance and security elements, task and purpose, general location, breach lane, all direct fire control measures that will be utilized, target reference points, engagement area, terrain-based quadrants, threat-based quadrants, all planned indirect fire targets, any control measures that will function as triggers, any control measures that will facilitate friendly passage of lines, reconnaissance and security graphics, the specific locations of units. An execution checklist, or X-check, is an additional tool to keep track of key actions by significant time markers, and are often associated with brevity codes to refer to specific tactical actions or activities. This tool is commonly used, and there are a variety of different formats used across units. Now, the leader is fully prepared to brief his plan to his subordinates and conduct the seventh step of the troop leading procedures, issue the operations order.